welcome to part 3 of this series on principled negotiation. I'd like to review where we've been so far. In the first segment, we talked about positional bargaining, and both in its forms of hard bargaining and soft bargaining. We talked a bit about how positional bargaining sometimes results in, it often results in agreements. The question is, how satisfying are those agreements in the long term? And to what extent does the practice of soft bargaining or hard bargaining create a better negotiating environment overall? And we talked about how positional bargaining in general has invisible costs by creating stubbornness or planting the seeds for future conflict. And then last time we talked about the first of 4 steps, the first of 4 principles in coming up with a better way to bargain, to negotiate, what we're calling principled negotiation, or also negotiation on the merits. The first step was to separate the people from the problem. Now this time we're going to talk about focusing on interests, not positions. Let's get into that and talk about that now. When you focus on interests and not positions, you try to look behind people's words of what they're saying when they claim to need something, when they make statements about their initial bargaining position. We try to look behind that to find out what is it that they really need. Remember that a bargaining position is a calculated statement of what a negotiator believes they must fight for in order to get what they really need. So in that statement, I want to focus on the word calculated. It usually involves some deception and some changing of what you're really interested in because you think you need to start with something else. So if both parties are talking about their positions and not their interests, you end up with stalemates very often. So how do you get around that? Well, you explicitly, you intentionally seek to look for interests and not positions. And I'd like to give a couple of examples of what I mean by that. Suppose you have 2 men who are in a dispute over who gets to buy a cow. They're both saying that they need the cow. They're not saying why they need the cow. They're not expressing their interests in the cow. They're only saying that they want it, they're going to buy it, and the other guy cannot have it. Well, as long as both of them are saying that, their positions are not compatible with each other because only one of them, after all, can have the cow. However, if you explicitly seek to find out what the interests of the 2 men are, you might find that that although their bargaining position is not compatible with the bargaining position of the other player, their interests just might be compatible. Now, in this example of the cow, let's say that one of them is a butcher, and what he wants is to be able to take the meat from the cow and sell it in his butcher shop. And let's say that the other guy is a producer of leather products, and really he doesn't need the whole cow, he just wants the leather, the skin off of the cow so that he can make purses and shoes and other leather products. If these 2 men do not make clear what their interests are in the cow, they'll keep fighting over that cow until, who knows how long. Maybe eventually someone will win the argument, but how much frustration did they have to go through until somebody finally won? But if they are honest about their interests in the position, they realize that their interests are not incompatible. They therefore agree. They will both go into purchasing the cow together. One of them will take the meat, the other will take the skin. And in doing it in this way, the 2 parties, instead of having this fight with each other where they lose respect for each other, where they think the other person is stubborn, and possibly create the seeds of a fight over every other cow that they're ever going to buy, they start to respect each other and have an agreement that, well, in the future, this agreement worked out so well, let's do this again next time we need to buy a cow. They can actually have an agreement in which both parties can succeed, and they set up an environment where they can both succeed in the future as well. Another simple example could be 2 companies are wanting to buy a tract of land. One company is an oil company and the other company is a farming company. Now, neither one of them say why they want the land. They're just going to fight over the land in the courts until they've spent millions of dollars in court fees, when really if they were to talk about interests rather than bargaining positions, they would come to some kind of an agreement where the oil company uses the minerals under the land and the farming company uses the surface. This is a simple example, a couple of simple examples of the difference between fighting over what your bargaining position is and what your actual interests are. This same parallel can exist in a family situation. Let's say two brothers are having a conflict over who gets to use the family car. One of them just wants to make sure that the car is going to be treated properly. The other needs to be able to get to and from where he wants to go. Those two interests are not incompatible. But if they don't talk about their positions and the one brother says, I need the car, and the other says, no, you can't use it, they will have a fight for a very long time. So you can think of this principle of focusing on interests and not positions in just about every arena of life where negotiations or bargaining takes place. So in order to learn how to focus on interests and not positions, let's look at some practical instructions about how to do that. To begin with, if somebody expresses a bargaining position, remember it's the first calculated thing that they state that they need, start to ask why they're saying that they demand that. Ask why. What is it that they're hoping for? What is it that they need out of the situation? What is it that they want to gain? Ask why. When they give an answer, ask why to that answer. Dig a little bit. Try to get down to what's really deep in the person's thinking. In exchange for digging a little bit into the way they're thinking to find out what their interests are, give a bit of concession and express to them what your interests are in the negotiation. Lead the way. Show an example. What is it that you're interested in? And look to find out what they are interested in. That way you begin to create a conversation on the basis of interests, not positions. If they say that something you're expressing is not possible, ask them why not. Maybe they've got some concerns or that they see some obstacles in the path of following your plan. Well, ask them, why is it that they see that that's an obstacle? The purpose of doing that is that you get down to what some of their deeper concerns, what some of their deeper interests really are. Let's look at the example of two brothers fighting over the use of a car. One of them says, I need the car. That's his position. The other says, I'm not going to let you use my car. That's my position, period. Well, if the one brother who needs to use the car starts to ask, well, why not? He might find out that the brother who owns the car is concerned about taking care of the car. That's more of an interest. He wants to protect his assets. He doesn't want his car to be damaged. He doesn't want it to be stolen, perhaps. Perhaps it's possible that he doesn't fully trust his younger brother with the use of his car. Well, once you start talking about the interests, and if the two brothers can respect each other, separate the people from the problem, respect each other's interest, the younger brother then, since he is also separating the problem from the people, he's not looking at his older brother as the problem, but he's looking at trying to find a solution to this car usage situation, is going to say, okay, well, I understand now that you have an interest in keeping your car in good condition. So now they can start talking about that. Perhaps there is an agreement that can be made where the younger brother will promise if any damage happens to the car, he'll pay for it. Maybe the younger brother has to put up some money ahead of time that they'll put in safekeeping with their father. If the younger brother damages the car, the older brother gets to take the money. In other words, you get beyond the positions and you start talking about interests. Now on the other side, suppose the younger brother really needs to get somewhere and he believes that he needs to drive himself. The older brother could say, well, I've got lots of time. I can drive you there. I would be happy to drive you there. See, if they're no longer talking about the younger brother's demand to use the car and start talking about his interest in getting to work on time, his interest in having reliable transportation, they can start to talk about their interests, not their positions. And they find out those interests by asking questions of why. Why do you need something? Why are you asking for this? Or why not? Why do you see that this isn't going to work? Why can't you accept that suggestion as a solution? You start to find out what the interests are and not just their positions. In this way, you begin to construct an idea of what the other party's perceived choices are. And when you begin to understand that, you can actually have a real conversation, not just a fight over positions. You also want to list each side's interests. Since you're now cooperative partners in a conversation, you're not adversaries fighting over whose position wins. You've separated the people from the problem, you're looking at the problem together, and you're focusing together on interests. Then you can begin to make a list, actually write it out on paper. Acknowledge and respect each side's interests as their own. Now, if I'm negotiating with somebody and I recognize that I have certain interests in the resolution and they have other interests, and I don't exactly agree with their interests, but it's theirs. It's what they are interested in, and I respect them. Then I'm going to be a cooperative part of the conversation, and as long as I'm getting my interests met, I am willing to see that their interests are getting met. It's a whole lot easier to find possible areas where your interests are not incompatible. So once you've made a list of the interests of each side, then you want to restate in as fair and accurate words as you can what the other side's interests are. State it in your own words. Have them hear you state what you think their interests are. Now they'll either say, no, the way you said it isn't really quite accurate. And then you give them a chance to tell it again. Likewise, they will tell you what your interests are in the way that they understand it. And it gives you an opportunity to say, well, you got most of it right, if that's the case. You got most of it right, but really, you're not entirely right. This is more what I'm interested in. You start to have a conversation about interests that way. People listen better when they feel they've been understood. If somebody thinks that they are not being understood, very often they will keep repeating their own position over and over again. Let's face it, we do that too. So if we are doing that, repeating ourselves, and they're doing the same thing, no one's listening. So that's why focusing on interests is a better strategy for conflict resolution, for coming to agreements. So as we begin to wrap up this section of our series, here are some questions for you to think about. Relate and think about an experience when you wanted something, but you started the conversation with a position that was different than your true interest. Let's say you started the conversation with a bargaining position. What happened? How did that work for you? Can you look back on examples where you started to talk about a bargaining position and coming to resolution took a lot longer because you weren't actually talking about what you need? Or how often has it happened that you talked about a bargaining position and the bargaining position wasn't what you really were looking for, but it's what you thought you needed to start with, and you actually got what you were asking for in the bargaining position, but you weren't really satisfied because it didn't actually resolve what your interest was in the matter. Interesting questions? Think about that some. Next time we come back, we'll talk about looking for options for mutual gain. That's the third principle in this series. Thanks for listening in today.